And one of the reasons that we wanted to hold this conference on the theme of the pandemic, other than it being the theme of the day, was that we think it's really important that anthropological voices come through here. And one of the joys of anthropology is that although, as we started with a direct approach around epidemiology, clearly there are so many perspectives we can bring in. And what we are now starting to do with panel 2, as you'll see with 3 and 4, is that we are expanding or zooming out in a way from the specificities of this, of the epidemiology of COVID, and looking more generally about the idea of pandemic and the sorts of discourses and debates that, that it brings up. So what I'd like to do is invite all of the speakers for panel 2 up onto the stage, and I think Rowan is going to just turn them from participants into panelists. And then we will have 3 papers, and just as in the first panel, we're going to go directly from paper to paper, 15 minutes per paper, and that should give us 15 minutes of discussion time at the end. And just to reiterate, at the end of the day in panel 4, in session 4, we will have time for a general discussion with all of the panelists. And all of the recordings from today will be online for a couple of weeks for further questions. So please do continue to add your questions to the chat as we go along. Any that aren't addressed directly today can be addressed in the following discussion. So thank you very much. I'd like to welcome Christos Linteris from the University of St Andrews to give the first presentation.
Hi, Simone. Hi, good morning. Thank you very much. So today I'm going to talk about COVID-19 as a mystery. So let's start with some kind of basic historical background. An important part of human encounters with epidemics concerns the ontology of the disease in question, the what is of any given outbreak. This has not always been part of human experience, but rather the result of the development of disease ontologies both in Western medicine and in other medicines such as Chinese medicine. In the West, the passion for classification assumed particular force in the course of the 18th century, and then was further amplified first in the early to mid-19th century through debates around contagion, and then by the bacteriological revolution from the 1870s onwards, which could match distinct disease ontologies with observable microorganisms. Historians have dedicated considerable effort to the examination of epistemological, political, and social processes around the ontological stabilization of diseases like yellow fever, cholera, malaria, or plague. Now, as these were processes that involved not just the classification of a given disease, but also the identification of its transmission pathways, natural reservoirs, pathology, etc., they involved disputes, negotiations, and accommodations long outlasting the laboratory identification of the causative agent of this or that disease. However, I would like to propose that entangled with these processes of ontological stabilization and informing our current experience of COVID-19 is another kind of ontological thinking, which is in operation when we encounter epidemics. One which is not so much concerned with what a disease is, but rather with what it must be. Now, in making this distinction, this paper relies on a pre-Socratic idea, which has been recently highlighted in a book-length essay called Creation and Anarchy by Giorgio Agamben, who usefully points at a distinction in classical philosophy between what he calls an ontology of apophantic assertion, the ontology of esti, from the Greek to be, and an ontology of command, the ontology of esto, from the Greek must be. Now, if Agamben argues the originary statement of Western apophantic ontology is to be found in Parmenides' single surviving work, the poem Periphyseos, on being, in the form of esti gar ine, which means there is actually being, the equivalent imperative ontological form is esto gar ine, which means in Greek, let there actually be being. Now, a good historical example illustrating the application of these two ontological registers or processes to the experience of and response to epidemics can be found in the way in which the third plague pandemic was approached at the turn of the 19th century. The third plague pandemic originated in the Chinese province of Yunnan, with the major outbreaks beginning in Canton and Hong Kong in 1894, and from there plague spread across the globe, infecting major ports and cities in all inhabited continents and leading to 12 million deaths. Now, as regards the apophantic ontology of the third plague pandemic, this of course involved already in 1894 the bacteriological identification of the causative agent of plague by Alexander Yersin, and thenceforth the gradual examination of the disease's transmission pathways, natural reservoirs, hosts, and vectors, which is ongoing, of course, until still today. Now, but for the third plague pandemic to become the first global chain of epidemics to be understood and talked about as a pandemic, what was required at the time was another ontological motion, which corresponds to the imperative ontology I would like to discuss in this paper. This was not performed so much in the pages of scientific papers as in the national and local press, including the illustrated weeklies of the time, and it relied on the mobilization of earlier ideas about the disease, plague, and in particular the early 19th century notion of the Black Death. The idea of the Black Death is a 19th century notion. Of course, it's not a medieval one. And it was an idea that was developed by the German doctor, Justus Friedrich Karl Hecker, in his book, The Black Death, written in 1832 and translated in English in 1833. Now, the development and diffusion of the Black Death as an idea, but also as what Nuhet Varlik has called a separate historical and nosological framework, on the one hand transformed understandings of the plague epidemics of the 14th century, while on the other hand, it attributed plague with a catastrophic world historical consequence. As Faye Marie Getz has argued, for Hecker, and I quote, "The Black Death was a demonstration of the power and glory of nature, so overwhelming in its universality and its terror as to defeat the best efforts of science to define it." Now, at the turn of the 19th century, the Black Death would become the pivot of the imperative ontology of the third plague pandemic and its individual outbreaks. Now, plague outbreaks across the globe came to be framed first as parts of a global pandemic, and second, as the potential starting points of a much larger world historical catastrophic event, something like a return of the Black Death. This created a scalar effect of vast proportions, so that even if an outbreak only affected a few dozen individuals, as was, for example, the case in San Francisco or Honolulu in 1900, it assumed global dimensions and was covered in the press across the globe as an event of existential proportions. The imperative ontology of plague, not as what it is, but as what it must be, was catalytic in establishing what we may call a pandemic experience, and is perhaps the most important legacy of the third plague pandemic today. For it instituted not simply a specific historical or biological comparison of the third plague pandemic with the Black Death, the 14th century pandemic of plague, nor just a metonymic operation between the two, but the very notion and experience of the pandemic, which was used for the first time, as an event threatening humanity with existential catastrophe. The pandemic would henceforth emerge as a notion associated with plague, not in its biological or historical estigar inne, its being, but in its imaginary estogar inne, what it must be. How does this then help us to approach COVID-19? Now, the apophantic ontology of COVID-19, or deciding what the disease is, has involved since January 2020 extensive scientific research, which has in turn helped identify the pathogen, its molecular structure, and clarify important aspects of COVID-related pathology and epidemiology. At the same time, however, in the broader public sphere, different outbreak narratives, to use Priscilla Wall's term, have been contending for what COVID must be. Now, I would like here to focus on a particular aspect of this imperative ontology, which identifies the origins of the pandemic as linked to some sort of secret. Now, living in an age of conspiracy theories, it is tempting to conclude that all the stories circulating online and offline about the origin or source of COVID being kept a secret simply form part of a contemporary zeitgeist that require no more explanation than that provided by contextualizing them within a matrix of hundreds of similar conspiracy theories. This, however, would be, I would like to argue, to overlook first the historical embeddedness of the pandemic secrecy narratives, and second, the relation of pandemic secrets to the wider notion of the pandemic as mystery. Now, let us briefly look at two of the most prevalent variants of COVID-19 as mystery. The first variant, systematically promoted by the far right, says that the virus was actually designed and leaked from the BSL-4 lab of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In response, a second variant, carried by several Communist Party-controlled Chinese media, has been purporting that the virus originated and or was manufactured in the USA and was introduced to China, possibly during the Military World Games held in Wuhan in October 2019. Now, developed in the context of a new Cold War-like antagonism between the two superpowers, it is tempting to interpret these variants as no more than propaganda in extremis, the most overtly propagandistic and conspiratorial version within a spectrum of usually less blatant or kitsch reiterations of epidemic blame. But that would be to miss the symbolic efficacy of this exchange. Now, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, the main anxiety of the Western world about the continuation of its recently achieved world dominance derived from so-called asymmetrical threats, individual hackers, Islamic terrorist groups, and emerging viruses being embodiments of these fears. An entire security and biosecurity apparatus, including preparedness, was based on these fears and was erected on the promise of this new world out of balance. Now, for some time now, however, the rise of China as a global power has come to challenge this edifice, this symbolic edifice, and has brought into existence a new bipolar narrative, which replicates to some degree the affective and symbolic structures of the Cold War. As part of an imperative ontology of the pandemic, the conspiracy theory mutualism between the USA and China symbolically asserts this new global symmetry, while in its narrative building blocks aims at a maximum populist appeal within the bounds of each superpower. On the one end of the spectrum, claims that the virus was manufactured in the Wuhan lab rely on a long-established trope in America's pandemic imaginary, revolving around the ideas of emergence, which, as Nicholas King has showed, arose in the late 1980s through several conferences and papers. Now, in these outbreak narratives, the notion of emergence has functioned as a way of encapsulating the connection of viral asymmetrical threats with a new, unstable, and unpredictable post-Cold War global political and economic condition. Positioned at a liminal state between the old and the new, the entity that seems to distill the potentiality and peril of this process of emergence is post-socialist China, coming out of the cold and yet not having made, that's what how the narrative goes, a clean liberal cut with it. China is often portrayed today as a land where new economic and social forms or forces are constantly emerging, but also as a country where this emergence is not transparent due to the continuing hold of power by the Communist Party. In the past decade, SARS was an important point of reference as regards this double process of emergence and its discontents, reflecting anxieties in the West over China's global influence. Seen as arising out of deregulation, opening up, and entrepreneurial explosion in the Chinese South, in 2003, SARS was believed to have been allowed to spread and threaten global health because of the Communist Party's predilection to secrecy. In 2020, with the arrival of COVID-19, this image of China was rekindled in spite of the unprecedented cooperation of the country with international health organizations, the sharing of vital data, and the continuous dialogue with the WHO. Whereas in reality, nothing in 2020 resembles 2003, the image of China as a secretive empire has been appealing to large audiences in the West and has come to bolster the obscurantist approach of the pandemic by the US president with nationalist and xenophobic hues that are no longer in any way covert, but have even led, as of late, to the suspension of US funding to the WHO, which this narrative and Donald Trump portray as China's puppet. On the other end of the spectrum, the public reach of China's imperative narrative about COVID-19 within the country itself, within China itself, needs to be read in the context of long-standing narratives in China about American imperialism, and more specifically about bacteriological warfare as part of it. As historian Ruth Rogatsky has explored in depth, the image of the USA as a bacteriological warfare aggressor was an important part of the emergence of communist hegemony in China in the 1950s. When Mao Zedong accused the US of using Chinese prisoners of war, the leading scientists of the infamous bacteriological warfare factory Unit 731 to develop biological weapons and launch a germ attack against the People's Republic in the course of the Korean War. While in China,
let me ask you to round up soon.
Yes. While in China, the credibility of this or any conspiracy theory is fostered by the current xenophobic climate in the US, we need to take this conspiracy theory seriously within the political ontology of China's party state. Now, to what extent does this imperative secretization of COVID-19 entail the disease being experienced as a mystery? I would like to argue here that we need to approach the idea of mystery in the liturgical reading of Odo Cassel and consider it to be not simply the hidden truth of a disease emergence, the natural laws of viral mutation, virulence, etc., but more crucially, a natural praxis, a process through which nature actualizes and dramatizes its own imminence. Now, this brings us back to the emergence of the experience of the pandemic in the late 19th century as mediated by the newly instituted category of the Black Death. For it was through this mediation that pandemics were seen as world historical dramas, which revealed the true nature of societies they struck, and ultimately of human nature as such. So, in conclusion, from this perspective, the various conspiracy theories around COVID-19, forming as they do part of its imperative ontology, are not simply iterations of the wider explanatory framework in the post-truth world, but more importantly, historically rooted and epistemologically resilient frameworks of epidemic blame, whose geopolitical content and mythic form constantly interact with one another so as to produce repulsive and yet ethnographically and historically significant interpretations and experiences of catastrophe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's an excellent opening to this session. Thank you. Please keep adding your questions to the chat and we will pick them up at the end. But now I'd like to move straight to Pooja Satyogi for her paper on the everyday economies of labour transaction.
Thank you. In its initial avatar, this paper was called Perverse Economies. It's still called in a different form of writing, Perverse Economies of Intimate and Personal Labour. I think I would like to stay with the word perverse, even for this one. I'll take up questions on method, I think, in question answer form, because I just noticed that there are people who are asking questions around method. I'm not going into that in this reading. There are three things that I do want to develop on. One is what I call secularization of casteism. Two, why in the context of the subcontinent, it is really only ethnographic work that can show us anything about how the demographics, as it were, of the pandemic, because unlike the COVID racial tracker, where there is no such thing, there is no data bank tracking demography in India. So you have, on the one hand, you have a body like the migrant laborer. On the other hand, of course, you have a body called the comorbid body, and both of these bodies are supposed to be somewhat self-explanatory, as it were. Other than that, of course, there is no emergence of any other kind of third body. And the third is a doubling of contagion, which is what I'm going to build on in the paper. In May 2020, Kent, a leading manufacturer of electrical appliances in India, advertised a new product, a flour kneading and bed making device. The advertisement asked the potential buyers of the appliance, are you allowing your maid to knead flour dough with your hands? Her hands may be infected. Let automation take care of hygiene this time. The advertisement, of course, was subsequently removed. And this time, as the advertisement mentioned, was, of course, a time of contagion, which attaches a differential burden on domestic workers in the Indian subcontinent. The mother-daughter actresses from the Indian film industry, who are Kent's brand ambassadors, also apologized, saying that the views expressed in the advertisement did not reflect their values and are inappropriate. It was unclear what their values were or what they had found indecorous in the commercial itself. Nevertheless, the entire debate on and it wasn't a very feisty debate, basically registered the problem around class, whereas actually I think the problem should have been articulated as a caste problem. The advertisement symbolically indexed how women domestic workers' bodies are imagined to be sites of contagion. But again, the contagion over here was class. So I'm going to argue that the contagiousness of the disease is building, at least in the subcontinent, on an already existing template of caste pollution and domestic labor. It would be erroneous, as it were, to interpret it only along class lines. This is in my mind. It had started as an intuition around March when I had written an editorial for a newspaper. But thereafter, of course, I've sort of become more and more convinced of this, and as more work started coming, of course, it just seemed like this would be the case in India, even as we have no data sets to, as it were, map how caste is going to how pandemic is going to be, as it were, a caste atrocity. In India, the unlock period has allowed some domestic workers to return to work. This is amid government advisories of greater risk of contagion generally. And I am relying on my work in Delhi, although my work has been in Delhi and Hyderabad. And I'm going to sort of pick up precisely on those practices that we now worship: hand washing, social distancing, mask wearing, to say how pandemic, how the casteism, as it were, of the pandemic begins to attach itself to these practices, and has, in the case of domestic labor, begun to inflect intimate and personalized labor relationships in a way that entrenches hierarchies enabled by caste practices. I said that I'm going to work with the idea of a doubling of contagion, by which I mean a culturally polluted person rendered even more pestilential because of contagion, but whose services are nonetheless needed to disinfect the space of the employer's home. I want to say here that the pandemic is inflicting additional moral burdens on the workers to protect themselves and, by extension, their workspaces from infection. And of course, they are attempting to do this even as reciprocities towards them, or even common civilities, especially also of spreading contagion, are being borne less by the employers. There is a way in which employers work by imagining a linear flow of infection, which is from the worker to the employer and not vice versa, which itself is, one would imagine caste practices also work in that way. We do know that domestic work is characterized by the most extreme forms of informality, or the fact that they are not recognized in public spaces through legislation in any way whatsoever. We also know, in the context of the subcontinent, that close to 90% of domestic laborers are actually not given any kind of remuneration by their employers. We also know that the idea of containment of threat that comes from a polluted body is something that caste hierarchies privilege. But the important thing over here, and people have pointed this out, is to say that actually the negotiation in domestic service is such that neither side typically enters a relationship with any predetermined control. So with that, I'm going to sort of come to what my intuitions were in March, and then I'm going to come to the ethnography. In Hyderabad, which is where I also live, but I work in Delhi. I just do this intercity travel quite often. Some of the workers had begun sort of just at the start of the lockdown, or just before the lockdown, had begun to see that there was a change in the way their employers were now approaching them, like calling them less frequently, getting them to do 3 days dishes in one go, not quite caring about the fact that dishes were not just dirty, but they actually had cockroaches. So I had 1 or 2 domestic workers who reported to me, and they said that, the assumption here is that I'm the cause of contagion, but why is there no civility extended towards me? Why the hell should I be made to do dishes that have cockroaches in them? Or for that matter, work got even more restricted because some workers were only asked to clean toilets and not do any other work in the house. And the most horrific example of this was when a domestic worker was actually asked to sweep the house as she exited the house, which was a classic caste ritual, with, as it were, cleaning your steps, as it were, as you sort of went out. And the interesting thing here was that this wasn't indexing at all to bodies of low caste women. These were Muslim women. So from there, I started thinking about that what we're really looking at is a secularization, as it were, of casteism. What that was, like I said, in March, was just an intuition. And then, of course, came the lockdown, and then, of course, came the post-lockdown period. And over here, I'm going to just stay with one person's experience of what it meant to go report back to work, as it were. And I'm going to sort of think through. It's interesting that in the earlier panel, the word architecture and engineering came up, but I'm using the word architecture a little differently here to say that we need to think about what the architecture of lockdown, how the architecture of lockdowns is shaping conditions of work for returning domestic workers. By architecture of lockdown, I want to index a range of relationships and negotiations that come into play along with the physicality of lockdown, which then has a bearing on how successfully work is resumed and continued. I do not offer an exhaustive list, but these can include, as they did for my informants, landlord whose property a worker might have rented, disallowing her to work for fear of bringing in disease, but nonetheless hoping to get rent from her. Neighbors objecting to resuming work, neighbors also facilitating resumption of work, workers' anxieties with respect to her own family members' health, conditions imposed by resident welfare associations of apartment complexes on workers, individual employers negotiating with workers' landlords, over and above her own conversations with each of them, and finally daily negotiations and transactions of workers with their employers in their homes. I'm looking at one domestic worker whom I'm calling Rachna, who was working in a Delhi, who used to work in a Delhi residential urban complex. And the story here is about two houses that are both on the 4th floor of buildings that do not have elevators, but they are also very specific in their architecture because they have corrugated tin roofs, which basically and corrugated tin roof then becomes part of the pandemic precisely because of the way in which things like civilities like social distancing, mask wearing attached to living in these kinds of residential structures because they just get heated up. I mean, temperatures in Delhi in June were about 46 degrees centigrade when I was doing this work. And she worked in two houses that faced each other. So one was a bachelor in his early 30s, and the other was a woman professor in a leading Delhi University college. Rather than sort of going into the details of, I think what I'm going to do here is to just sort of come to instances of how mask wearing and cleaning sort of map onto the pandemic, and how practices of caste becomes a ready-made template around this. In both these houses, of course, she had to wear masks, but masks were also provided to her by the employer. Sometimes, of course, she would wear the same mask in both the houses, but at different points in time, there were many confrontations about the civilities of mask wearing, including my informant, Rachna, having to wash used masks of employers around which there were fights. But again, what she kept telling me was that the burden of wearing the mask in 46 degrees of temperature was entirely on her and nobody else. And so the kinds of solutions that were offered to her in this heat were that she could just step out onto the terrace and take a breather. But there was also a doubling over there, because in 46 degrees temperature, you don't step out and take a breather. In fact, the assumption almost here is that you step out into the terrace and you get disinfected, as the heat ends up disinfecting you as well. So even there, an idea of caste practice and disinfection was working somewhat disproportionately. I'm not going to sort of the other and each of these. So whether it was social distancing, mask wearing, mask washing, all of these practices were also tying into inherent anxieties or inherent little animosities, as it were, that existed in the relationship between the employer and the domestic help. And they would from time to time sort of just come up, mask being the thing around which this would then be negotiated, or mask being the thing around which the negotiation would fall through. The other practice was of lining the dustbin, not so much taking out of the garbage and who's going to eventually take the garbage away, because that is a practice that is completely sort of determined by caste in the context of India. So I'm not sort of talking about that, who takes the garbage away from the house, because it takes me outside the house. And like I said, you see a pervasive form of casteism there. I want to stick with the house itself and what happens within the house. Simon, did you?
2 minutes, please.
Sure. And over here we see how fights would break out around who would line the dustbin, whose job it was to put, let's say, plastic bags in the dustbin. And of course, from the point of view of the employer, the assumption was that they were not going to touch it. But from the point of view of my domestic worker, she didn't want to touch it because dustbin would be the site where masks would be discarded, or any other material that could be contagious could be discarded. And yet, like hierarchies around this newly sort of newly created lists of tasks that she had to perform, invariably sort of meant that they were mapping around ideas of pollution in ways that were somewhat unprecedented for her. So I suppose, I could
maybe just conclude.
Yeah, maybe I could just do that. So the long hours of work, as it were, or and the tyranny and the oppression and the one-sidedness of disease-related civilities eventually, of course, cost her the job. She was asked not to come after June, and of course now she's looking around. So caste in my article works as an existing template of labor on which mechanisms of disease control draft themselves. One-way compulsion of mask wearing, and all of these things that I have just spoken a little bit about. Of course, it's adjacent to ostracism and eviction faced by doctors and nurses in many parts of India, are quite indicative of how easily practices of caste have assimilated into a biologized discourse of keeping contagion at bay. So obvious for me is this implication that even the automated messages of the government urge people not to discriminate against those who are sick with coronavirus, instead of using the word. So it uses the telephonic messages use the word do not use the word sancromic, which is the word for a contagion, but actually use they say bhed bhav na kare, which means that you should not socially ostracize people. And yet at a far more expansive level, caste myopia proliferates. I think I'll just stop here, somewhat abruptly, but I think I'll just stop here.
Thank you very much indeed, Bridget. Thank you. It's super.
All right. Thank you.
So we'll move directly to Maid Han, who has a paper on the ugliness of multi-species intersubjectivity. Please, the other speakers, stay with us. Go ahead.
Hi. So I'm going to share my slides, so I'm going to disappear. Okay, so my paper is called The Ugliness of Multi-Species Intersubjectivity, Pandemic, Racism, and the Love of Animals in the UK. It is the year 2020, and we're facing two simultaneous crises of enormous magnitude. One is the viral pandemic caused by COVID-19 that has drastically altered our daily conduct, which in turn has forced social, political, economic, and cultural changes in our lives. Most of us have been confined to our homes and neighborhoods under lockdown. We've had to start wearing masks to protect not only ourselves, but also others around us, and washing our hands with the deliberate thoroughness of a surgeon scrubbing into the operating room. We've become more reliant on our technologies than ever before, as physical social contact has been replaced by technology-mediated meetings on conference call software. Adapting to this crisis has not been an easy task, especially for individuals, communities, and societies that were already marginalized. The other crisis is the centuries-long and still ongoing racism that has in recent years manifested in violent and disturbing forms, including extreme police brutality. While the state-sanctioned murder of Black people has been happening at an especially large scale in the US, the UK is far from innocent. Catalyzed by the murder of George Floyd, who died saying, "I can't breathe," with a cop's knee on his neck, the swelling frustration and anger from the unending injustice in all spheres of society boiled over this year. Black Lives Matter protesters in masks took to the streets to challenge the systemic ways in which Black people have been persecuted for centuries, from slavery to the prison industrial complex, from the disproportionately high rate of death by COVID to murder by police and civilians alike. For Black people, the viral crisis and the racial crisis are inseparable issues that both pose a threat to their lives in intersecting ways. But out of all the places, the place that sparked the questions, what kinds of narratives emerge and spread when a viral crisis and a racial crisis coincide, and who is considered contagious by whom and why, was a UK-based online dog community. In this paper, I traced the history of human and non-human intersubjective entanglements in the UK in order to understand the historically specific socio-political landscape of Britain that is enamored with animals, especially dogs. Then I present a digital ethnographic account in the form of a meme and a comment responses to the said meme in order to demonstrate the compatibility of love of animals and anti-Black racism. I argue that the prevalence of dehumanization by animalization of Black people stems from the combination of deliberate white ignorance, as well as the hierarchical conceptualization of animals as subhuman things to control and manage, rather than living, thinking, and feeling entities with whom we share our worlds. Tracing the history of pedigree dog breeding in Victorian England, Harriet Ritvo contends that dogs and humans were implicated in one another, as stratified leisure activities such as animal breeding served as a valuable index of social status. Breeding dogs was a scaled down and more affordable version of horse breeding, fit for the urban middle class who couldn't easily participate in livestock breeding. But because the urban middle class households were not breeding dogs to serve specific practical functions, pedigree dog breeds developed almost entirely for the pleasure of admirers, and as such, the desire and ability to manipulate rather than to produce animals that could be measured by such extrinsic standards as utility or vigor were celebrated among dog fanciers. And this was at least in part the doing of the Enlightenment, when the perception of nature, which included animals, shifted from something to fear to something more vulnerable to human control. And once this shift from fear to control became firmly grounded in the public consciousness, nature became an object of affection, turning animals into pets in the eyes of Victorians in the first half of the 19th century. And then emotional and analytic associations tended to blur the distinctions between humans and non-humans, which then led to the intersubjective linking of human concerns, such as social, economic, cultural, and moral concerns with the natural and animal world. And with this intersubjective link, combined with a desire to control, manipulate, and dominate, came a few mutually reinforcing implications for dog-human relationships. First was the association of the quality of a dog with the status of its owner. So purebred dogs were privileged over crossbreed dogs as companion animals because owning a well-bred pedigree dog meant being regarded as a socially and even morally superior human. So in other words, there was a socioeconomic class segregation for both humans and dogs that went hand in hand, linking humans and their canine companions closer in both rhetorical and physical proximity as cherished members of a newly emerging intersubjective and multi-species family. And this connection between humans and non-humans has some alarming moral implications today. With the status of human beings and that of non-human animals firmly joined in the hierarchical conceptualization of the world, different kinds of people can be mapped onto different kinds of animals for discriminatory purposes. So for example, Katie Hopkins wrote in 2015 that gunships should be used to stop migrants after a fishing ship capsized, killing almost 1,000 migrants. She said, "Show me pictures of coffins, show me bodies floating in water, play violins, and show me skinny people looking sad. I still don't care." Her justification was that these migrants are like cockroaches that can spread like norovirus on a cruise ship. And on the other hand, non-human animals that tend to occupy higher rungs in the normative hierarchy in the UK, such as dogs, are able to enjoy privileges granted to humans that occupy a similar position in the hierarchy. So for example, Michael Gove promised that dogs will be granted freedom of movement post-Brexit, while humans who have no means of securing multiple citizenships will have to pay for costly visas to visit or work outside of their home country, and might even have to uproot their lives in the UK to return to the country of their citizenships. And it was in this strange and scary sociopolitical and cultural landscape that the COVID-19 pandemic coincided with the uprising of Black Lives Matter. And even though BLM protests have started and continue to be larger in scale in the US, the movement picked up across the UK shortly after the killing of George Floyd, highlighting issues of racism specific to the UK, as well as showing solidarity with the protests in the US. And in the world of dog enthusiasts in the UK, however, the conversation about the coinciding historic events quickly found its focus on police animals in line of duty during the protests. So on June 7th, 2020, I came across this meme on Facebook. So the photograph is of a protester about to throw a brick at a police horse. And the photo was actually taken at a demonstration against Israeli action in Gaza that took place in London in 2009. And the caption reads, "If you're Black or white, I don't care. You should be shot for throwing bricks at canine horses and dogs. Canine lives matter." The meme, which is clearly a response to Black Lives Matter, as the caption suggests, quickly caught the attention of members of the group and garnered hundreds of reactions and comments before it was deleted by the original poster for an unknown reason. But I managed to take over 80 screenshots of these comments before it was deleted, and I sorted them out to 3 broad categories here. 1, those in total agreement with the caption with a fair dose of colorblind racism and antagonism toward the protesters. 2, those calling for violence toward the protesters in the name of love of animals. And 3, those against the protesters because of the role that they might play in the spike in COVID-19 cases. So the first category of comments is defined by the lack of real engagement with the topic and a lot of name calling. Disgusting scumbags, lawless scum, and vicious bunch of thugs are just some of the terms that the animal-loving racists use to describe Black Lives Matter protesters. The commenters also denied any possibility that they could be racist because they, quote, don't care if they're black, white, blue, or multicolored. But what I want to focus on here is that there was also a fair few people who chose to call the protesters animals as an insult. Someone said, "If I call someone an animal to describe the people rioting, I was told it's racist." She further elaborated that calling someone a dickhead is not a racist, just as calling someone an animal isn't either. The animalization of BLM protesters works to literally dehumanize the protesters while simultaneously calling into question the commenters' love of animals. It makes clear who gets to be considered human and who doesn't in their minds. Protesters, vast majority of whom are Black people and people of color, do not get to be humans, instead getting conferred the status of animals. And not only that, but it also makes clear that the commenters unquestioningly believe themselves to be the arbiter of human, non-human distinction. The second and the largest category of comments is characterized by the desire for violence toward and for the incarceration of the protesters, as well as the appeal to the government to take a stronger stance that involves the military. Some lamented that it's a shame that the horse didn't trample him. And quite a few expressed that water cannons should have been used against the protesters, and others called for gun violence. I say shoot them for breaking the law, wrote Johnny, an Oxford-educated man living in London. Shoot them on sight, I say, no excuse, Ashley from Sedgley echoed. Some even voiced their desire to take matters into their own hands. If I see anyone harming an animal, their head will leave their body, wrote Zoe from Edinburgh. Personally, I'd taken them out and shot the lot of them, wrote Lucy from Scotland, getting 5 likes for the comment. Escalating this violent atmosphere further, some said that the government ought to use more militaristic methods. One wrote, "Deadly force of rubber bullets should be used now," bringing to mind that the many images of American BLM protests who have lost their eyes and lives due to their rubber bullets being fired at their heads. And others commented that Boris Johnson should have used his arsenal and complained that it was time Britain toughened up. "The army should be sent in to take them down," said Ian from Edinburgh. "Let's see how tough these morons are when face to face with an army team." Some were more sinister, saying that the protesters needed to be stopped by absolutely any means possible. And even if we were to look past the irony that these commenters are asking for exactly what triggered the BLM protests in the first place, it is appalling that what these comments indicate. That these white British people would happily see non-white people die at the hands of the state or even their own hands for causing pain to police animals who were deemed innocent and just doing their jobs. Then in the eyes of these commenters, the protesters are not just subhuman, but also below police animals in their hierarchical view of the world. They're vermin to be exterminated. And in this way, they also think of themselves to be the authority on who gets to live and who should die. The last category of comments is defined by its appropriation of the discourse of fear surrounding COVID-19. Even though data showed that there was no drastic uptick in new COVID-19 cases from protests, thanks to mask wearing and taking place outdoors, some of the commenters were adamant to preemptively blame the protesters for the second wave of the pandemic. They believed that the protesters were using Black Lives Matter as an excuse to get out of lockdown, and that this was an act akin to putting their fingers up to everyone who has kept the rules, the NHS, and all the 40,000 people who have died from COVID. Calling the protesters selfish, foolhardy, absolute waste of space, and even plague carriers, the commenters accused the protesters of not respecting social distancing and refused to accept racism as a significant crisis that deserves attention. Yvette from Bishop Stortford heartlessly said, "I hope they're proud when they take the virus home and kill a loved one." Penny from London complained that they'll take the virus home and to their families and a shame if they get NHS treatment should they need it. In this way, they fully believe that COVID-19 is the more pressing and more deadly issue than racism, mainly because they've never experienced racism themselves, which was made painfully clear by Penny, who also wrote, "Lots of white people get killed too, you know." This is especially evident in a few other comments, such as "COVID is the threat today and you are going to kill us all for the sake of 4 dodgy cops." These statements are, of course, in complete ignorance of the fact that Black and brown people have been dying and continue to die at a disproportionately high rate from COVID due to systemic racism in the healthcare system, and also that racism, and not just COVID-19, has been declared a public health crisis in itself. They also conveniently ignore that Matt Hancock and Dominic Cummings have both been caught breaching social distancing, and that thousands have ignored social distancing during the heat wave to pack the beaches around Britain. So on top of being the arbiter of human, non-human distinction, the judge of who should live and who should die, as well as a hopeful executioner, the commenters regarded themselves as the authority on who is considered contagious in this viral times.
Maybe if you could move to conclusions. We've got a minute or two left. Thank you.
So the narratives that emerged expose the ways in which white people can comfortably reconcile the love of animals and hatred towards Black people and people of color. And this can be attributed to something that Charles W. Mills calls white ignorance, which is a cognitive tendency, an inclination that encourages systemic misperception and dissemination of this misperception. And Mills further argues that we all view the world through concepts, which are inherited orientation that drive perception. And this explains the unquestioning and unhesitating ways in which the commenters animalized, wished violence upon, and accused BLM protesters. And in this, this specific ethnographic instance of white ignorance in the dog world includes the misperceived belief that portrays Black people and people of color as non-human animals mapped onto a hierarchical conceptualization of the world. In this misperception, non-human animals are seen as things to control and manage, and even the police animals that they were defending are under human control. But the difference between police animals and Black people and people of color who are labeled animals is that we refuse to be controlled and managed like compliant animals by white people and white normativity. We talk back and we call out their ignorance and continue our struggle against the violence. We challenge their misperception, their misrepresentation of us, and their unfounded sense of supremacy over us. And clearly they can't stand it. The discomfort is palpable as they respond with verbal abuse, even more violence, and baseless accusations. So thinking through the lens of white ignorance then, it's not difficult to see what stood in the way of the emergence of a narrative that is both pro-animals and anti-racist in this space. But for that to happen, white people must be willing to challenge white supremacy despite the discomfort it may cause. That is, they have to understand how certain social structures tend to promote these crucially flawed processes, how to personally extricate oneself from them, and to do one's part in undermining them in the broader cognitive sphere. they must also be willing to address human supremacy that is implicated in systemic white supremacy, the tiered polarization of non-human animals and humans that regard multi-species relationships as a unidirectional and asymmetrical exertion of power from humans to non-humans must be contested, instead encouraging a more horizontal, more cooperative view that visualizes our interconnected, more than human world as an infinite assemblage in which everyone, every being has a significant part to play in one another's life course.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. So we have had a few questions, and I think one of the things that's moving into this, or that's moving from the first panel into this, is the question of communication. And we've had a couple of really interesting questions around the role of social media, which perhaps could be considered by you in a broader sense in relation to the spread of, or the way that existing narratives find new platforms in which to adopt new events or absorb or interpret new events. So I think that might be a way of thinking of the what links the three papers in a way, because I think all three of you have emphasized the reframing of existing, or the reframing of something new into existing metaphors and narratives and discourses. So I think you've probably seen the questions on the chat. Would you like to respond to those, any of you? Perhaps I can invite Pooja to go first.
Okay. Kirat, I actually don't think you and I are saying different things. So you're saying, I just wonder if these social interactions could also be reflecting a resurfacing of non-secular ideas of pollution, unless of course both of us differ in our idea of what we mean by secularization. I think there is actually no distinction in what you and I are saying. I am working with secularization as a secular spread. That is to say, it doesn't matter. I mean, at one level, of course, pervasive casteism in India does matter. But at another level, what I'm saying is that caste is a ready-made template that is quite easily mobilized across castes onto people across castes. So that's where doctors and nurses it is identities of them being doctors and nurses where social ostracism begins to play out. The template is of caste, but the spread is somewhat secular, unless of course we are saying, so you're right that it merges with secular ideas of contagion covered under a discourse of class. I don't think there is a difference between what you and I are saying. I think you and I are on the same page, unless of course I've got, unless of course I am to understand something different from your usage of the word non-secular.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Can we ask perhaps first Christos and then Maeve to think about this reference to social media?
Yeah, sorry, this is not my field. I don't really have to say anything about social media.
Well, I'm just in terms of the spread of conspiracy theories, which you discussed in some detail. Would that have been possible in relation to the Black Death, where the means by which discussions were happened were rather different and privileged different voices?
Sorry, I haven't done the research on this.
Okay.
I have to be very strict for myself as a medical anthropologist. I don't comment on things that are not within my field of expertise. But in terms of continuities and discontinuities, of course, there are many discontinuities, right, in the construction of this mystery, because with the third pandemic, which established the idea of the pandemic, there was this idea of an ancient disease coming back, and an ancient disease coming back from what in the colonial mindset and framework at the time, was the source of this ancient disease coming back, where, people or races in the thinking of the time that, were moribund or degenerate, etc., etc. So there is this whole colonial racist narrative about degeneration, which is mainly applied to the Chinese and China as the source of the Black Death and of plague, right? Today, we also have a xenophobic narrative or framework of COVID-19, but there is a crucial difference here. It's that China is seen as an emerging kind of power, and COVID-19 is also part of this ontology of emerging infectious diseases. So it's not an ancient disease coming from a moribund country or culture in the colonial imagination. It is an emerging disease coming from an emerging society. So it's, you know, there are similarities. The racism is similar, and the target of the racism is similar. And of course, the whole colonial baggage and framework, you know, has not been, you know, challenged or corrected in any significant way, in my opinion, in epidemiology itself. I mean, epidemiology itself is thoroughly colonial. You know, yet there is this difference, you know, between a focus on degeneration and a focus on emergence. And I think that brings significant differences in the public discourse and in the violence which manifests itself, you know, not only online, but on the streets, right, against people who are seen as responsible, mistakenly seen as responsible for this outbreak.
Thank you. Maeve, as well as thinking about this this context of the social media, I just wondered if you had any reflections on the point that came up earlier this morning when Nick Long was talking about castigation of flouters, and whether there's some parallel here.
So I'm reading through the comments now about that from Jeanette Edwards, the post-truth era that, you know, is kind of made more easily possible by social media. And I definitely think is the case in case of this meme, even because that picture, as I said, wasn't taken from BLM protests. That picture was taken in 2009, like almost 10 years ago now. More than 10 years ago, oh my God. At like a completely different protest, different contexts, yet these people are making memes out of it to fit the purpose that they want to serve about, you know, saying like BLM is, you know, harming animals, this is not humane. And there was actually quite a few commenters who were like, oh wait, like this picture wasn't actually taken at any of the protests. But so many of these people just came to defend the meme, saying that it still serves the purpose of spreading the message that we want to spread, which is violence against police animals should be stopped. And they just, you know, like they just did not see this as something akin to fake news or post-truth or anything that really needed to have that kind of like integrity, I guess. Yeah, so in that way, like social media definitely makes it easier to spread something that might not be fully or at least partially true. And also the fact that the whole post and the comments were deleted for unknown reason. Like it's so easy to just post something that may not be true. And if it gets reported or if like, you know, the comments turn out to be a bit too inflammatory for group rules or anything, people can just delete it. It can just disappear. And that just kind of leads to complete lack of accountability for anyone who can post.
Absolutely. There's another interesting question here from Vlad Shula-Costa about whether there's an imaginary on certain people deserving rights and others not.
Yeah, so at least implicitly, I think a lot of these people who are very much against BLM protests don't really think of like fight against racism and like equal rights for all races as like an actual human right. Thus the animalization of Black people and people of color to kind of like once they're animalized and they're not considered humans, of course they're not deserving of human rights because they're not humans. So whereas, you know, animals that they're trying to protect and saying that, you know, like canine lives matter, canine horses matter, like they are animals who deserve animal rights because they're animals that are innocent and just doing their jobs. So human rights discourse like don't really even apply here because they're not really thought of as same humans as white British people, normal people.
Which of course is a very old trope in in Britain of animals deserving more rights than people, and it's often criticised. We are running out of time. I think there's some really interesting themes emerging so far this morning around the kind of metaphors of disease and of infectiousness and the way that they feed into other structures of thought or are incorporated by the structures of thought. And we've heard mention of witchcraft and geopolitics and casteism and so forth. I'm wary of the idea that we don't want to go back to ideas about the infectiousness of ideas and the rather problematic context that those bring up. But I just think it's interesting to think through the way where these metaphors then lead us. So if we have a medical metaphor of racism as a pandemic, for example, does that then suggest that we should be looking for inoculation or cures, or is it something that can be eradicated and so forth? That we get led into these particular ways of thinking that are quite determinative in some ways. So I think these questions will come up again this afternoon, and I hope they'll come up in the conversation. And please feel free to add further questions during the break and in this afternoon's sessions. As you know, we'll reconvene at 1 o'clock for the next session. We will have continued discussion later on this afternoon at the end of the final session, because we just have 2 papers in that session. And as I say, we'll continue the conversation online in the next 2 weeks. I'd like to thank the speakers from this session very much indeed. It's been a really fascinating session. And I'm sure that more questions will emerge, and as you reflect, we'll have further discussion later on. So thank you very much indeed, and I look forward to seeing everybody back again at 1 o'clock.